and welcome to Foster English. Today I want to talk to you about the 4 basic kinds of sentences. Now granted, there's a lot more than 4 kinds of sentences, and we're going to be doing videos on different kinds of sentences when it comes to basic sentences or simple sentences, when it comes to compound sentences, complex sentences. There's a lot of different kinds of sentences in that regard, but when I'm talking about the 4 basic kinds of sentences, I'm really talking about the 4 different motivations that anyone will have to say or write anything. Ever. 4. That's it. That's all there is. There's 4 reasons to speak or to write. And I know, you're probably thinking, there's a lot more than 4 reasons. But I challenge you, when you hear me out, when you go through this video and you really think about it, all of the reasons that you might have to express yourself in speaking or writing will fit into one of these 4 categories. I pretty much guarantee it. And again, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Prove me wrong. Let's communicate. But here it is. So first, we actually need to know what a sentence is. And simply put, a sentence is a complete thought. That's it. And in order for a thought to be complete, it needs to have a beginning, it needs to have some sort of substance in the middle, and it needs to have an end. One of the ways in which we are going to define these 4 basic ideas of what a sentence is, or rather the 4 motivations for saying or writing anything, is with those end point punctuation marks. And in English, there's actually 3. So again, I know there seems to be this inconsistency here, right? 3 different end point punctuation marks, ways to finish sentences, but 4 basic motivations. Doesn't seem to add up. And the 3 end point punctuation marks are actually definitive. They will define for us 3 of those 4 kinds of motivations or basic sentence ideas. The last one can actually use 2 of the 3 endpoint punctuation marks. This will all be a little clearer once we get into it. So let's just do that, shall we? We'll get into it. So the first of the 4, the first motivation, the first reason for speaking or writing anything is simply to get whatever it is you have in you that needs expressing out into the world. And I know, that already has to fill pretty much all of the motivations for everything, because that's such a general way to put it, and you're right. This motivation pretty much falls into the category of all-encompassing, except that the other 3 motivations, the other kinds of sentences, or the other kinds of motivations, add something to that first basic motivation, okay? So the first one is simply a declaration or a statement, or what we might call a declarative sentence. So, as it sounds, a statement is simply saying something, right? It's giving information. And that's all declarative sentences do. They give information. And that information may be part of a speech. It may be my opinion. It may be repeating facts or ideas to someone else. It might be theories. It might be way out there. It could be stories. All of this is simply the transfer of an idea, or rather a complete thought, which usually consists of many ideas, because words are ideas, or sometimes pieces of ideas. But we put them all together in order to form sentences. And the most basic version of that is the statement, or the declaration, or the declarative sentence. Statements, declarations, declarative sentences, all the same thing, end with a period in writing. So the beginning would be a capital letter. The thing of substance in the middle would be the subject and the verb. And then the end, after whatever other language is there to clarify what is happening with the subject and the verb, at the end of all of that, there would be a period. And that would be your declarative sentence or your statement. The second kind of sentence takes that motivation of self-expression of some sort of an idea to get some sort of thought out into the world, and it adds something to it. It adds another layer of context. And generally speaking, as human beings, that added layer of context is emotion. So if the first layer is idea or logic-based or reason-based, the second layer is emotion, emotionally based, which is, granted, a whole other realm of expression and therefore communication. We often express emotions without language. So what this second motivation, this second kind of sentence is actually doing is it's expressing emotion with language. And sometimes those two can be in conflict. So how do we recognize this? In interpersonal relationships, if it's you speaking with someone else, especially if it's face-to-face, usually the emotion is pretty apparent. I hope. At least if it's intended to be. And you can recognize that emotion during your communication, for better or worse. In writing, it can be a little bit more hidden or harder to determine what exactly the emotion is, because we don't use different punctuation for all of the different emotions. We only use this one, the exclamation mark. That is the second kind of sentence when we talk about these four basic sentences in terms of motivation. The exclamation, or the exclamatory sentence, is the second kind of sentence. And all it is a declaration plus emotion. So let's go through an example. If I enter into my home and I say, I'm home, I'm making a statement. I'm just telling you where I am. I am home. But if I enter into my home and I say, I'm home, well, now there's an added layer of context to my information of me being home, and you can probably tell I wouldn't want to be here. Similar, if I say, ugh, I'm home. If I'm expressing the idea with sadness or anger, then people will get a very specific read on that information. It's coming with the added context. Alternatively, I could walk in the door and go, I'm home! I'm home. Because maybe I'm happy to be home. The problem comes when, in writing, all three of those ways of expressing my being home would be written exactly the same. In quotations, I'm home! Exclamation mark. So whether I'm happy, sad, angry, frightened, whatever the emotional context, the exclamation mark covers all of it. So the important thing is to just understand that the exclamation mark is adding emotion to the language of the declaration, which means the syntax or the word order for declarative sentences and exclamatory sentences is essentially exactly the same. You can make any declaration into an exclamation by adding a little vertical line at the end of the sentence. Now, with the third kind of sentence, the third motivation or reason for saying or writing anything, the motivation is a little different. And so is the end point punctuation mark. We have, in the first two, in the declaration and in the exclamation, we have a delivery system of a thought. But in the third kind of sentence, we're actually trying to clear the road to receive more information. We're trying to elicit or pull some sort of information from some sort of source of information. We do this by asking questions. The question mark is the only way, really, to positively identify a question in English. And what it means, what that little hook is doing, is it's trying to hook and pull, trying to catch more information from some kind of source, whether it's the sea of information that this world has to offer or someone specific. If you are asking a question, you're asking to get more information. That is, if you're asking in good faith. There are some people who use these hooks to tear and poke and rip holes in ideas without really offering any information in return. There are a lot of people who use the tool of the question to open up areas of ideas, and all of this has its place, but just know that questions can be used as weapons or means of opening up possibilities, and that could be a legitimate rhetorical device. What I don't like are people asking questions and never offering any kind of information by way of a response. And the rule for me in this channel, just so you know, is I don't fear any questions. And I believe, going back to that free speech idea, is that any question should be able to be asked. But, again, going back to that free speech idea, the responsibility of the person asking the question should be willing to answer the question for themselves and be willing to accept whatever response that they are given by way of a response. Sometimes the answer to a question about my personal life might be, well, I'm sorry, that's none of your business. And that's a perfectly legitimate answer to a question that the person being asked believes to be too personal. On the other hand, if someone is going to ask me something, or if I'm going to ask something, I should have an idea, or I should not be afraid of that same question being asked back to me. That's sort of my standard. But we're getting a little off track. The point is that questions are most easily identified in writing by the question mark. In speech, generally we hear a rising intonation or a rising inflection when somebody asks a question, but not always. Sometimes questions are more easily identified by the inverted syntax of a question. And this isn't always the case. You can simply make a statement or make a declaration and add a question mark, and the end result, especially in writing, would be a question. To go back to that earlier example, if I enter the door to my house and I say, I'm home, that really changes the meaning of those words into something else. There's going to be a story there. If I'm questioning that I'm home, I'm confused in some way, how did I get here? There's a lot more to unpack, and you need to be very careful of using question marks in declarations because they can drastically change the understanding of the language. Usually, questions will invert the syntax, or they will change the order of words, particularly of the verb and the subject. In questions, if someone were here and asking me, are you home? My response to that, I am home, you would be able to identify the inversion of the syntax, or the switching of the word order. And that's an important thing to be able to hear when it comes to questions, especially in speaking. Not always the case. Just know that the motivation, what you really want to identify is this person seeking more information from me? Because in order to do that, they're generally going to be asking a question. Or they'll be taking advantage of this fourth basic kind of motivation, which is to elicit some sort of response, not by way of information, but by way of action. And in order to do that, we use the command or the imperative sentence. I don't actually know if I mentioned this. That third kind of sentence, the question, can be called a question, obviously, or it could be called the interrogative kind of sentence, or an interrogative, some people will say. An interrogative sentence or an interrogative sentence, you can hear in that the word or the idea of interrogate or interrogation, which is to ask a lot of questions about someone. So that's one way to remember that kind of sentence or that motivation. So again, back on the command or the imperative. This is the one and only kind of sentence in English that may be just one word. And that word would be a verb, some sort of action, okay? Because that's what commands are doing. They are seeking an action from someone or something. The reason that you might have a single word command is because you still have the idea of a subject within a command. It's simply implied. Because commands are generally given to the person, place, thing, or whatever that the command is issued to. And I know it seems odd to issue a command to a place or to a thing that doesn't have the will to respond, but we do it all the time. The point is that the implied subject, the implied idea of that noun is always, generally, you. The person, the you, that I want to respond to whatever it is the command is. We get this a lot in teaching, obviously. I can't tell you how many times I have told my students, listen. Listen to me. Go. Just do your homework. So in all of these sentences, right, the first basic beginning of whatever that idea is the verb. The basic idea is that the verb begins because the person, the subject, is you. So how do commands end? How do we end commands? We have already exhausted the three end point punctuation marks in English. We have the declaration with the period, we have the exclamation with the exclamation mark, and we have the question with the question mark. Well, commands follow those first two motivational rules, right? If it's stated as a declaration, if there's no emotion within the command, it would end with a period, and that would imply that there is an absence of more context, emotional context. If the command ends in an exclamation mark, there's some sort of emotional context layered on top of the information of the command. So that's it. Those are the four basic kinds of sentences. And again, when I'm saying that, I'm saying the four basic motivations for speaking or writing anything, ever, in English. We have the statement or the declaration or the declarative sentence, which is simply delivering information, nothing else. We have the exclamation or the exclamatory sentence, which ends in the exclamation mark and delivers information with some sort of emotional context layered on top. We have the question or the interrogative sentence or the interrogative sentence, which doesn't give information as much as elicit or desire to pull information from some sort of informative source. And lastly, we have the command or the imperative sentence, which doesn't look to give information, but looks to get some sort of action as a result of this expression. If you can think of anything that you can say or write that doesn't fit into one of those 4 categories, comment below. I will be learning something, and that's something I hope to do, and hope that we can do together from here on out. Anyway, thank you again for your time, for your patience with me, and for your support.